Science is built on curiosity, but sometimes experiments grow far beyond what anyone expected. From psychological studies that spiraled out of control to engineering tests that revealed huge hidden flaws. Here's 15 experiments that went too far. Starting with number 15, the Stanford Prison Experiment. The Stanford Prison Experiment is one of the most widely discussed studies ever conducted. It was led by psychologist Philip Zimbardo at Stanford University in August of 1971. The experiment aimed to examine how people behave when placed in positions of power or subordination within a simulated prison environment. The study recruited 24 healthy, psychologically screened male college students, and they were randomly assigned to be either guards or prisoners in a mock prison built in the basement of Stanford's psychology building. The quote-unquote prisoners were unexpectedly picked up at their homes by real police officers, an element added for realism but approved of ahead of time. They were booked at a local police station, blindfolded, and driven to the mock prison. Once there, they were given uniforms, assigned numbers, and placed in small cells. The guards received uniforms, whistles, and mirrored sunglasses designed to make eye contact impossible, increasing the psychological divide between the roles. Importantly, the guards were told that they couldn't use physical force, but they could create rules and maintain order. What followed took a dramatic turn very quickly. Within the first day, some participants adapted to their roles way more intensely than expected. Several guards imposed strict routines and designed demanding tasks for the prisoners. Some prisoners showed signs of emotional stress early on, including crying and anxiety. One participant experienced such intense distress that he had to be removed from the study after only 36 hours. Over time, a few guards escalated their behavior by enforcing increasingly strict penalties, though accounts of how severe the actions were have been debated for decades. Zimbardo, acting as the prison superintendent, didn't intervene as early as many critics believed he should have. Eventually, on the 6th day, 8 days before the planned end date, a graduate student observing the experiment raised concerns about the behavior of both guards and researchers. After discussing it with his team, Zimbardo decided to stop the study. Now, this experiment has been criticized for methodological problems, including small sample size, lack of proper controls, and the possibility that participants behaved the way they thought the researchers wanted, rather than acting naturally. In 2018, released audio recordings and interviews raised further questions about whether some guards were explicitly encouraged to act tough. Zimbardo disputed some of these criticisms, but acknowledged that the study wouldn't meet ethical standards used today. And despite all its controversies, though, the experiment contributed to major reforms in psychological research ethics. Modern guidelines now require clearer informed consent, oversight, and participant safety measures, and the ability for participants to withdraw without pressure. The Stanford Prison Experiment is a real historical event that's taught widely in psychology courses, though it's now often used as an example of how not to design or supervise a study. While its findings are debated, its legacy lies in the conversations it sparked about ethics and the responsibility researchers have to protect their volunteers. The events of those 6 days continue to be analyzed, discussed, and reassessed more than 50 years later. Number 14. The Milgram Obedience Study. The Milgram Obedience Experiments, conducted by psychologist Stanley Milgram at Yale University from 1961 to 63, remain some of the most well-known studies in modern psychology. They were designed to understand how ordinary people respond to authority figures, particularly when asked to perform actions they believe may harm others. Milgram began planning the study shortly after the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a Nazi official who claimed he was just following orders. Milgram wanted to test whether regular people, placed in a control setting, would obey instructions even when doing so conflicted with their personal morals. Volunteers were recruited through newspaper ads and were told they would participate in a study on memory and learning. Every session included 2 participants, a teacher and a learner. In reality, the learner was an actor working with the research team, and the real volunteer was always assigned the teacher role. The teacher was instructed to read word pairs and administer an electric shock to the learner each time he gave an incorrect answer. The shock generator wasn't real, but it appeared convincing, with labeled switches ranging from mild to potentially dangerous levels. During the session, the learner intentionally made mistakes. With each incorrect answer, the teacher was told to increase the shock level. As the shock supposedly intensified, the learner acted as though he was in increasing discomfort, eventually shouting, begging to stop, and later falling silent. When participants hesitated, a researcher in a lab coat used these predetermined prompts like, "Please continue," or "The experiment requires that you continue." These prompts were firm, but not physically forceful, meaning the decision to continue was always resting with the participant. Milgram found that a surprisingly high percentage of volunteers continued administering shocks even after expressing discomfort or moral conflict. His published results indicated that 65% of participants delivered the maximum shock level, though they often did so reluctantly or with visible stress. These findings led to widespread public debate and extensive scrutiny. Critics have since raised questions about some aspects of the study. Some argue that Milgram's methods were too stressful, while others question whether participants truly believed they were administering real shocks. Archival research in the 2010s uncovered notes and recordings suggesting that some participants had doubts about the setup, though many still behaved as if the situation were real. Milgram's findings, while influential, are therefore interpreted with caution today. This study helped bring some major changes to research ethics and standards in the United States and other countries. The institutional review boards, the IRBs, now oversee experiments involving human subjects, ensuring informed consent, the right to withdraw, and protection from excessive stress. The Milgram experiment is still cited in psychology, ethics, and sociology courses as a real historical case that changed how behavioral science operates. But despite the controversy, the study's core question, how far people will go in following instructions from authority, remains an important topic of research. Number 13, the Monster Study. So the Monster Study was a real speech development experiment conducted in 1939 at the University of Iowa by Wendell Johnson and his graduate student Mary Tudor. It's now widely criticized for its methods, but the study's goal at the time was to better understand how stuttering develops in children. Johnson, who had a stutter himself, believed that labeling and negative reactions could actually trigger or worsen stuttering in young children. To test this idea, he designed a study that examined how different types of feedback might influence speech development. The study involved 22 children from the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home in Davenport. None of the children knew they were part of an experiment, and their guardians were not fully informed of the details. The children were divided into different groups, some of whom already showed signs of stuttering, while others spoke normally. The researchers then gave the children different types of speech-related feedback over several months, and in one group, children who spoke normally were repeatedly told that their speech had flaws and that they needed to be careful with every word. They were criticized for minor hesitations and told to correct themselves even when their speech was normal. Another group of fluent-speaking children received positive, encouraging feedback. Meanwhile, children who already had stutters were also split, with one subgroup receiving supportive comments and reassurance, while another didn't receive any additional pressure. The negative feedback group, particularly the fluent children who had been told they were beginning to stutter, experienced emotional distress. Some became self-conscious and more hesitant to speak. A few developed long-lasting tension around speaking, and though researchers didn't report permanent stuttering that matched clinically diagnosed cases, the emotional impact was serious enough that many later described long-term effects like anxiety about public speaking. This study remained largely unknown outside academic circles for decades. It was never formally published in a major journal at the time, partly because colleagues were uncomfortable with its ethical implications, even in the 1930s. And the name Monster Study was given many years later by critics who felt the methods were inappropriate and harmful. In 2001, journalists uncovered details of the experiment, which sparked some public criticism. The University of Iowa formally apologized to the surviving participants and their families in 2007, and several participants sued the state, and a settlement was reached with the state paying financial compensation. Today, the Monster Study is used as an example highlighting why ethical protections for children and vulnerable groups are now essential in psychological research. Modern guidelines require clear, informed consent from guardians, prohibit deceptive practices with children, and they demand strict oversight when emotional or developmental well-being may be affected. And while the study contributed to the understanding of how anxiety can affect speech, it is now remembered primarily for the ethical lessons it taught. Number 12, the Biosphere 2 Closed Ecosystem Experiment. Biosphere 2, it was one of the most ambitious experiments ever attempted. Built in Arizona and completed in 1991, it was designed as a completely sealed miniature world. Essentially, it was a giant greenhouse containing these multiple ecosystems. The idea was to see whether humans could live inside of a closed environment long-term with only the air, water, and resources produced inside. This facility was enormous. It covered over 3 acres and contained several distinct biomes. These included tropical rainforest, an ocean with a coral reef, a mangrove wetland, a savanna, a desert, and an agricultural zone where food could be grown. A crew of 8 people called biospherians were sealed inside the structure on September 26, 1991, beginning what was planned as a 2-year mission. The experiment started with optimism. The biospherians were responsible for growing their own crops, recycling all the air and water, and maintaining the various systems. Everything from oxygen production to soil health had to function as a closed loop, exactly as it would on a long-duration space mission. The crew worked long days farming, repairing equipment, and studying how the systems responded to daily life. However, things soon became more complicated than expected. One of the biggest issues was oxygen. Early on, scientists noticed that oxygen levels inside Biosphere 2 were slowly declining. This wasn't due to a leak, but to an unexpected chemical process in the concrete structure, which absorbed carbon dioxide. And because oxygen was turning into CO2 faster than the plants could balance it, the crew experienced lower oxygen levels similar to high-altitude conditions. To maintain the safety of the people in there, the additional oxygen had to be pumped into the structure. And this change was documented publicly, and it remains one of the best-known challenges from the project. Food supply also became an issue. The team grew all their own food, but crop yields were lower than expected due to soil nutrient imbalances, limited sunlight on cloudy days, and the sheer difficulty of managing an entire system manually. While the crew never faced starvation, they did experience low-calorie periods that required careful planning and adaptation. Another unexpected outcome involved the ecosystems themselves. Certain species thrived, while others struggled. For example, pollinating insects declined, which affected the production of some crops. Meanwhile, ants and cockroaches multiplied faster than predicted, and those changes provided some great information about how small ecological shifts can create larger effects in these kinds of closed systems. Well, despite the challenges, the experiment did achieve some significant value. It demonstrated how sensitive closed ecosystems are to small imbalances and how difficult it is to replicate Earth's natural systems on a small scale. The mission ended on September 26, 1993, exactly 2 years after it started. All 8 participants exited safely, and while the experiment didn't achieve everything it had originally hoped for, it did provide a real lesson for environmental science and potential future space habitats. Today, though, Biosphere 2 is operated by the University of Arizona, and it's a research and education center now. You can tour their facility, and scientists use this structure to study climate, soil systems, and water cycles. Number 11. The Little Albert Experiment. The Little Albert Experiment is one of the most famous studies in early psychology. It was conducted in 1920 by John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner at Johns Hopkins University. The study was designed to explore whether emotional responses, specifically fear, could be conditioned in a young child. At the time, Watson was a leading figure in behaviorism, a field that focused on observable behavior rather than internal thoughts. His goal was to show that fears could be learned rather than being purely instinctive. The participant, known publicly only as Little Albert, was an infant, approximately 9 months old at the start of the study. Researchers introduced Albert to a variety of animals and objects, including a white rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, masks, and burning newspapers. At first, Albert showed no fear towards any of these items, and this early phase established a baseline that the child did not naturally fear the objects. The conditioning phase involved pairing the presentation of the white rat with a loud noise. Each time Albert reached towards the rat, the researchers struck a metal bar with a hammer behind him, creating a sudden, startling sound. This noise, understandably, frightened the infant, and after repeated pairings, Albert began showing signs of distress when he saw the rat, even without the noise. This was the central finding. A fear response had been conditioned. The researchers then observed whether Albert learned fear generalized to similar objects. They found that he reacted fearfully to items resembling the rat, like a rabbit and a fur coat, showing that the conditioned fears could extend beyond the original stimulus. However, the study ended before researchers could attempt to reverse the fear through deconditioning, which would have involved gradually reducing Albert's fear in a controlled and supportive way. Now, the experiment became controversial for several reasons. First, Albert was an infant who could not consent, and his guardian likely didn't fully understand what the study involved. Second, intentionally causing fear in a very young child is now considered ethically unacceptable. Third, the lack of follow-up left Albert with an induced fear response and no documented attempt to ever correct it. For decades, Albert's true identity was unknown, but in 2012, researchers published the findings suggesting Albert may have been a child named Douglas Meret, though the conclusion has been debated. Today, the little Albert experiment is used in psychology courses as an example of unethical research practices and the importance of informed consent. It did play a role, too, in the creation of stricter ethical guidelines that governed emotional research. And while the study's results contributed to early behaviorism, the methods are now not acceptable by modern standards. It's a real and historically significant case that has shaped how psychologists conduct research today. Number 10. The MK-Ultra LSD administration experiments. Project MK-Ultra was a real program run by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency from the early 1950s to the mid-1960s. Its purpose was to study human behavior, interrogation resistance, and the effects of various substances on the mind. One component of the project involved administering LSD, or lysergic acid diethylamide, a hallucinogenic compound that was relatively new at the time. Researchers wanted to understand how it affected perception, communication, and decision-making. The LSD portion of MK-Ultra involved multiple sub-projects carried out at universities and hospitals and prisons and other facilities, and some participants were volunteers who agreed to take part in studies examining the effect of the drug. However, MK-Ultra is particularly known for its cases in which LSD was given to individuals who were not fully informed that they were taking part in an experiment. In some instances, people didn't know they had been administered the substance until after the effects began. Records released through public hearings in the 1970s confirmed that in certain programs, full consent procedures were not followed. This led to confusion, stress, or discomfort among participants who didn't fully understand why their perception had changed. One of the best documented issues involved researchers observing how long the drug's effect lasted and how people behaved under its influence. Reports indicate that these studies collected information about memory, concentration, and suggestibility. Some of the researchers also explored how prior expectations or setting could influence a person's response to LSD. And while the scientific questions themselves were not unusual for the time period, the lack of transparent communication, in some cases, violated ethical norms. A related concern noted in some official investigations was the record keeping. Some documents were incomplete, and others were destroyed in 1973 when the CIA ordered files to be eliminated. Because of this, there are gaps in the documentation, and some details about specific projects are uncertain. Researchers rely today on declassified materials, Senate reports, and testimony that was given during the 1975 Church Committee hearings to understand what happened. Public criticism of MK-Ultra played a major role in reforms to U.S. research guidelines. These reforms align with the international standards now that have been developing since the 1940s. But the MK-Ultra LSD experiments are now studied as an example of why transparency and consent are critical in scientific work. It is a well-documented and historical case that helped shape modern research regulations. Number 9. The Mars Climate Orbiter Experiment Failure. The Mars Climate Orbiter was a real NASA spacecraft that was launched in December of 1998. Its mission was to study the Martian atmosphere, the climate, and how water might have moved across the planet's surface. The spacecraft reached Mars in September of 1999, but the mission ended unexpectedly due to one of the most famous engineering calculation mistakes in space history. The spacecraft's navigation required precise calculations. NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, used the metric system, which is standard for almost all modern missions. However, one of the contractors responsible for part of the spacecraft's software used imperial units, specifically pound-seconds instead of newton-seconds, to measure the force exerted by the orbiter's small thrusters. This difference meant that the software sent navigation data in units the NASA team didn't expect, and as a result, the spacecraft's course corrections were off by a significant margin. The incorrect data slowly had built up over time. Each small miscalculation slightly altered the spacecraft's trajectory. By the time it reached Mars, the orbiter was flying much lower than intended. Instead of entering orbit at the target altitude of around 140 kilometers above the Martian surface, the orbiter dipped to an estimated altitude of 60 kilometers. At that height, Mars's thin atmosphere created way more drag than the spacecraft was designed to handle. Because the spacecraft was out of expected position and communication signals suddenly dropped, NASA lost contact on September 23, 1999. The orbiter is believed to have either burned up in the atmosphere or skipped off the atmosphere and disappeared into space. No attempt was made to recover it because the trajectory ever made it impossible to re-establish contact. Despite the loss, the incident led to improvements in NASA's project management and quality control. Standardized unit systems became the mandatory, and agencies strengthened cross-team verification procedures. And this failure also emphasized the importance of redundancy in mission planning. This story remains one of the most widely cited engineering case studies. It's taught in universities and engineering programs and software courses as a real, factual example of how these small inconsistencies can cause major setbacks. Today, this is remembered not only for what it was supposed to accomplish, but for the lessons it taught future space missions. Number 8. The Cold War Starfish Prime High-Altitude Test. Starfish Prime was a high-altitude test conducted by the United States on July 9, 1962, during the early years of the Cold War. Unlike ground-level experiments, Starfish Prime took place way above the atmosphere, about 400 kilometers above the Pacific Ocean. The purpose of the test was to study how high-altitude energy releases affected satellites, atmospheric chemistry and communications, and the Earth's magnetic environment. At the time, scientists had limited understanding of how large-scale energy releases interacted with the upper atmosphere. The event produced an unexpected result. One of the most notable was the creation of an artificial radiation belt surrounding the Earth. These belts were formed because charged particles released during the test became trapped by the Earth's magnetic field. Scientists discovered that these particles could remain in orbit for months, circling the planet and affecting objects in space. This did have real consequences for satellites. Several early satellites, including Telstar 1, Ariel 1, and Track, experienced a damage or technical failure in the months following the test. Another result involved radio communication. The test created temporary disruptions in radio signals across parts of the Pacific. Researchers realized that energy releases at high altitudes could affect long-distance communications, and that helped scientists develop better models for predicting communication interference during space weather. People in Hawaii, over 1,000 kilometers away, reported seeing a bright glow in the sky. And this glow happened because particles interacting with the atmosphere produced visible light, similar to the auroras seen near the poles. Before the test, scientists didn't fully understand how energy releases could spread across large regions of the magnetosphere. Afterwards, it did become clear that the events far above the atmosphere could impact technology on the Earth and in orbit. Today, Starfish Prime is studied for its scientific lessons. Data collected during and after the event helps scientists understand the Van Allen radiation belts, better predict space weather, and develop more durable satellites. And although the events of Starfish Prime took place during a tense political period, the scientific knowledge gained has been useful for decades. Moving on to number 7, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge Aerodynamic Experiment. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapse in 1940 is now one of the most famous engineering case studies in the world, not because anyone intentionally designed an experiment, but because the bridge itself unintentionally became one. The structure is located in Washington State. It opened on July 1, 1940, and was at the time the third longest suspension bridge in the world. Engineers had designed it to be slender and lightweight to reduce construction costs. However, the design choices created some unforeseen aerodynamic effects that turned the bridge into a real-world experiment in wind behavior. Almost immediately after opening, the bridge developed a tendency to move in the wind. Locals nicknamed it Galloping Gertie because even moderate winds caused it to ripple and twist. Engineers at the time had not yet developed the aerodynamic testing procedures used in modern bridge design, and wind tunnel studies weren't standard practice for these structures. On November 7, 1940, sustained winds of around 40 miles an hour produced oscillations much larger than anything seen before. The bridge began to twist along its central axis, moving in a pattern that's called torsional flutter. This type of motion wasn't fully understood at the time, and instead of simply bending up and down, the bridge rotated back and forth, with each side rising and falling in opposite directions. The movements grew stronger, and after several hours, portions of the bridge deck gave way. Engineers, photographers, and journalists on the site recorded the motion, documenting one of the best-known structural failures in history. Modern suspension bridges now undergo detailed wind tunnel testing, and they use open trusses and stabilizing cables, tuned mass dampers, or other features to reduce this wind-induced motion. But this collapse is still taught in engineering programs. It's a real example of how unintended design choices can create these experiments with valuable lessons. Today, the replacement bridge incorporates modern design principles that came directly from the lessons learned in 1940. Number 6. The Space Biosatellite 2 Experiment. Biosatellite 2 was a NASA mission launched in September of 1967, designed to study how living organisms adapt to space. The satellite carried biological specimens, including plants, insects, fungi, and microorganisms, to observe how the absence of gravity affected circadian rhythms, growth cycles, and basic cellular behavior. One of the main focuses was the circadian rhythm, the internal biological clock that governs our sleep-wake cycles, the growth and behavior in organisms. At the time, scientists were still learning how much light, exposure, and gravity and other environmental cues influence these cycles. Space provided a great environment to test how living systems behaved when these familiar cues were removed. The satellite orbited Earth for 45 hours. Sensors monitored temperature, humidity, radiation, and oxygen levels, while the instruments tracked biological responses. For example, plant seedlings were placed in rotating chambers to simulate day-night cycles using artificial light. Fruit flies, a common research organism, were included to study developmental timing, and microorganisms were carried to measure how cell division rates changed under weightlessness. Although the goals were well designed, the mission had some complications. Originally planned to last several days, the biosatellite was cut short due to technical concerns about the spacecraft's systems, and NASA decided to return the capsule early to ensure the specimens could be recovered safely and the data preserved. After it was retrieved from the Pacific, scientists studied the specimens to compare them with identical control groups on Earth, and they found that some organisms maintained surprisingly stable patterns, while others showed shifts or irregularities, and these findings helped scientists identify which process depended most on environmental cues like gravity. This whole experiment demonstrated that even simple living systems change their behavior in a microgravity environment, and it helped later guide experiments on Skylab, the Space Shuttle, and in the ISS. Today, space biology has advanced significantly, but Biosatellite 2 is remembered as one of the foundational missions that revealed just how complex life's response to space can be. Number 5. The Pitch Drop Experiment. The pitch drop experiment is one of the longest-running experiments in history, so long that it's continued for nearly a century. It was started in 1927 by Professor Thomas Parnell at the University of Queensland in Australia. The experiment was designed to demonstrate that pitch, which is a black tar-like substance, is actually a liquid, not a solid, even though it appears and feels hard at room temperature. Parnell placed heated pitch into a glass funnel, allowed it to cool and harden, and then set the funnel upright so the pitch could slowly drip into a beaker below. No heat source was used afterwards, and the experiment relied entirely on room temperature conditions. Because pitch is extremely viscous, each drop takes several years, or even more than a decade, to form and fall. The first drop took 3 years to fall, and later drops took even longer as the environmental conditions changed. Now, the experiments only produced about 9 drops in almost 100 years, and no one actually witnessed a drop fall until 2014, when a separate setup at Trinity College Dublin finally captured a drip on camera. Although simple in design, the experiment does have value. It shows that some materials behave differently than they appear. Pitch is a viscoelastic polymer, meaning it's got characteristics of both solids and liquids, and this experiment shows how viscosity can vary by many orders of magnitude depending on temperature and pressure. This experiment continues in real time, with the next drop anticipated many years from now. Though it remains a blend of curiosity and scientific communication, it shows that even a simple setup can lead to decades of learning. Number 4. Project Acoustic Kitty. So, Project Acoustic Kitty was a real Cold War-era experiment conducted by the United States Central Intelligence Agency in the 1960s. The goal was unusual and, by today's standards, impractical. Intelligence researchers wanted to determine whether a trained house cat could be used as a mobile listening device to gather audio information in a controlled environment. The idea stemmed from a limited technology available at the time. Portable microphones and transmitters were bulky, and intelligence agencies were exploring unconventional solutions. In the experiment, engineers and animal behavior specialists attempted to develop a system that would allow a cat to carry audio equipment while behaving naturally. The hope was that the animal could wander near selected targets, maybe park benches or open offices, without attracting any suspicion. Training sessions involved conditioning the cat to move towards specific locations when prompted. Researchers did attempt to design lightweight, compact equipment that wouldn't interfere with the cat's movement. However, the project quickly ran into difficulties. Cats are famously independent animals, and they don't reliably follow commands the way a trained dog does. Even with conditioning, the test animals didn't consistently move towards the locations the researchers intended. During the trial runs, the cats often became distracted by everyday stimuli like noises, food, or movements in the environment, and those distractions made the idea impractical because the cat's behavior couldn't be controlled well enough. Technical challenges did also appear too. The equipment needed to be small, stable, and safe for the animal. While the project avoided harmful methods, the technology at the time wasn't advanced enough to make the system comfortable or reliable. Batteries were heavy, transmissions were inconsistent, and microphones picked up too much background noise to be useful. By the late 1960s, the project was shut down. Declassified reports later described the effort as not practical, and the idea was ultimately abandoned in favor of more traditional methods. Project Acoustic Kitty remains a great example of how creative but unrealistic designs sometimes emerge during technological explorations. Today, it's often referenced as an example of the unexpected directions Cold War research sometimes took and how limitations in training and technology can make even ambitious ideas unworkable. Number 3. Project Pigeon. Project Pigeon was a real U.S. World War II-era research program led by the psychologist B.F. Skinner. The idea, while creative, quickly became an example of ambition going much farther than practicality allowed. The project aimed to train pigeons to guide missiles accurately. Importantly, the pigeons were not harmed during the research phase. The project focused on behavior training and guidance mechanisms. It's widely cited today as a great example of how unconventional ideas sometimes receive serious funding before their limitations become clear. During the early 1940s, guided missile technology was still in its infancy. Engineers struggled to make missiles that could home accurately on a target, and Skinner, whose research focused on how animals learn through reinforcement, proposed a novel approach. Pigeons could be trained to recognize a target visually and steer a missile toward it by pecking on a guidance screen. Well, Skinner believed pigeons' quick reaction times and strong conditioning responses made them ideal for that task. The plan involved placing trained pigeons inside of the nose cone of a missile. A small screen displayed the target as the missile approached, and the pigeon would peck the screen in the direction of the target's image. The screen was connected to the missile's control surfaces, and if the pigeon pecked slightly left, the missile would adjust left, and so on. To the researchers' surprise, many pigeons performed remarkably well in these controlled test conditions. Skinner and his team built several working prototypes. They designed comfortable interiors, ensured the pigeons had stable positions, and tested their accuracy. The birds proved consistent and focused within the laboratory environment. Skinner even demonstrated the system to military officials using live pigeons guiding mechanical displays that mimicked a missile flight path. But despite its technical success, the project did face some skepticism. The idea of birds guiding advanced military equipment was difficult for many decision-makers to even accept. Military officials raised concerns about some stability, like weather turbulence, vibration, or unexpected visual patterns that could distract the pigeons during real flights. There was also concern about the biological systems under stress. Engineers argued that the electronic and mechanical guidance would eventually outperform animal-based methods. By the mid-1940s, emerging technologies were improving, and the military shifted focus towards radar-based and eventually computer-assisted guidance systems. Today, Project Pigeon is taught in psychology and engineering courses as a lighthearted but factual example of how far experimental thinking can venture. This project was a fascinating episode in the overlap between behavioral sciences and the early guidance technology. Number 2. Project Mohole. So, Project Mohole, it was a major U.S. scientific initiative intended to drill through the Earth's crust and reach the Mohorovičić discontinuity, commonly called the MOHO. That's the boundary between the crust and the mantle. It began in the late 1950s, and it quickly became one of the most ambitious Earth science experiments ever. While the scientific goals were legitimate and well-defined, the project became an example of an experiment that expanded far beyond its original scope, eventually becoming too large, too expensive, and too complex to continue. The initial idea was pretty simple. Create a drilling platform in the ocean, where the crust is thinner, and drill down until reaching the mantle. Doing so would provide unprecedented geological samples, helping scientists understand the Earth's composition and heat flow, and the project was led by the National Science Foundation and carried out by the American Miscellaneous Society. That's a scientific committee created specifically for unconventional research ideas. In 1961, early tests proved successful. Using an offshore barge near Guadalupe Island in Mexico, the team drilled more than 600 meters below the ocean floor, at the time, the deepest scientific ocean drilling ever achieved. These results generated excitement in the scientific community and showed that deep ocean drilling was technologically possible. However, after this promising start, the scope increased significantly. Engineers proposed a purpose-built drilling ship equipped with advanced positioning, a technology that could automatically keep the vessel in place without anchors, something never before attempted at this scale. This complexity of the design grew, and costs rose. The required number of engineers, contractors, and consultants expanded far beyond the early projections. By the mid-1960s, the project structure became difficult to manage. Budget requests increased, and Congress began questioning the financial oversight. Meanwhile, NASA's Apollo program was commanding a large portion of science funding during the same period, making federal support for this costly Earth science initiative more limited. Report evaluations found that cost estimates were inconsistent and the long-term planning lacked any clarity, and by 1966, Congress discontinued the funding, effectively ending the project. The drilling ship was never built and the MOHO was never reached. Despite its cancellation, though, it produced some contributions to science. It proved that deep-sea drilling was possible, which directly influenced later deep-sea drilling projects launched in 1968. That program became one of the most successful research efforts in history, producing data that revolutionized plate tectonics and Earth science understanding. Today, Project Mohole is remembered as a real historical experiment that became too ambitious for its era. It stretched scientific coordination past their limits. And while the project itself ended, the techniques, tools, and lessons it produced paved the way for decades of oceanographic research. Number 1. The IBM Shoebox Voice Recognition Experiment from 1961. In the early 1960s, IBM launched a real experimental project called the IBM Shoebox, one of the earliest attempts to create a working voice-controlled computer. What began as a simple prototype became much larger, more complex, and more demanding than researchers originally anticipated. Although the device was only the size of a shoebox, the experiment behind it expanded far beyond initial expectations. The shoebox was designed by a team led by engineer William C. Dersch. At first, the goal was small: create a machine that could recognize spoken digits from 0 to 9. The idea was to demonstrate the potential for speech-controlled devices in business and consumer electronics. Voice recognition was almost unheard of at the time, and even simple speech processing required innovative new techniques. But once the team succeeded in building a system that could correctly identify digits, management asked the researchers to push it further. The project then expanded rapidly, and instead of just recognizing numbers, it was upgraded to understand 16 spoken words, including simple arithmetic commands like plus, minus, total, and subtotal. This meant the machine could act like a voice-controlled calculator, something decades ahead of commercial voice assistants. As the project grew, so too did its challenges. Speech recognition required the device to distinguish subtle differences in tone, pitch, speed, and pronunciation, all without modern digital processing. This all forced the team to build increasingly complex analog systems, turning what was originally intended as a small demonstration into a full research program. Because the device relied on early experimental microphones and analog filters, it struggled with background noise and differences between speakers. A voice command spoken clearly in a quiet lab sometimes failed during public demonstrations or when spoken by someone with a different accent. To compensate, engineers built multiple prototype versions and adjusted them repeatedly, making the project far more resource-intensive than planned. But the shoebox was publicly demonstrated at the 1962 World's Fair in Seattle. Visitors watched as the machine solved spoken math problems, a remarkable achievement for this era. But behind the scenes, the experiment had grown to require a large support team. The complexity had reached a point where commercial deployment wasn't feasible. But despite all the challenges, though, it was a scientific success. It proved that speech recognition was possible and encouraged IBM and other companies to invest more in advanced systems. In hindsight, the shoebox experiment went far beyond what the developers expected. What started as a simple proof of concept turned into one of the earliest attempts at building a voice-controlled digital assistant, long before the technologies needed to make it practical existed. Today, the original shoebox prototypes are preserved in a museum collection as important milestones in computing history. This experiment is remembered not for its failure, but for how far it pushed early engineers into exploring the future of human-machine communication.